The millionaire spoke softly. "I will teach you what true love is." She was just a housekeeper, but she carried an entire past in her eyes. He hides a secret that destroyed his last wife. If you like stories of love and romance, watch until the end. You won't regret it. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us where you're listening to this beautiful story from. Let's continue. The rain drummed against the windshield of the bus climbing into the Scottish Highlands, carrying Isabel Thorne to a destination she still didn't know would be her salvation or her ruin. At 37, she had learned that life had a cruel habit of turning certainties into ruins overnight. The simple cleaner's uniform was folded in her worn leather bag, a painful symbol of how a university literature professor could find herself forced to start from scratch. The scandal still burned in her memory like a wound that refused to heal. Marcus, her ex-husband, had been more than a corrupt politician. He had been a master of emotional manipulation, using her as the perfect facade for his dirty schemes. When everything came to light, he didn't hesitate to throw her to the media wolves, painting her as an accomplice while he fled with the stolen money. The newspapers loved the story of the naive professor who turned a blind eye to her husband's crimes. Social media was even more merciless. Now, with Olivia, her 16-year-old daughter, depending on her, Isabel had swallowed her pride and accepted the first job that came along. The Alistair mansion needed a cleaner. The domestic employment agency had been strangely vague about the details, mentioning only that the family was private and the house was large. The salary, at least, was too generous for the job, a first sign that nothing there would be ordinary. The bus stopped at the end of the paved road, where an old van was waiting for her. The driver, a man of about 60 with a weary look, barely nodded when she introduced herself. "Mrs. Thorne, I'm Mr. Angus. I'll take you to the house." His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Have you worked in a large house before, ma'am?" "No, but I'm a fast learner." He studied her through the rearview mirror as he drove along the winding dirt road. "At the Alistair house, you learn more than just how to clean and organize. You learn when to speak and when to keep quiet, when to see and when to pretend you've seen nothing." Isabel felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean by that?" "You'll understand." Mr. Angus parked in front of an ornate iron gate that opened automatically. "Just a piece of advice. Don't ask questions you don't want to hear the answers to." The Alistair mansion emerged from among the trees like a vision from a Gothic novel. 3 stories of imposing architecture, with ivy-covered columns and tall windows that seemed to watch her with suspicion. The surrounding garden was overgrown with wild plants, as if nature were slowly reclaiming civilized territory. Mrs. Martha, the housekeeper, received her at the main door. She was a stout woman in her 50s, with grey hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that missed no detail. "Welcome to the Alistair mansion. I hope you last longer than the others." Her tone was dry, almost hostile. "Let's go over the rules. Nothing on the 3rd floor. The covered mirrors stay covered. The library can only be cleaned when the master isn't there. And—" she paused dramatically, "don't meddle where you're not wanted." Isabel followed the housekeeper through the immense corridors, trying to absorb the grandeur and melancholy that seemed to permeate the walls. Family portraits looked down at her from gilded frames, but she noticed that many had strange marks, as if they had been torn and then restored. "Where are the other staff?" "There are few of us. Me, Mr. Angus, Rose, who looks after. The kitchen, and Julian, who doesn't speak." Mrs. Martha stopped before a door. "This is your room. It's in the staff wing. The master likes his privacy." The room was small but clean, with a window overlooking the abandoned garden. Isabel placed her suitcase on the bed and looked around. It wasn't what she had dreamed for her life, but it was a start. "Is Mr. Gideon at home?" Mrs. Martha hesitated. "He's always at home, but that doesn't mean you'll see him. He appears when he wants to appear." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "And when he does, you'd better be prepared." "Prepared for what?" But the housekeeper had already left, leaving Isabel alone with her unanswered questions. That first night, Isabel could barely sleep. The mansion made strange noises, footsteps in the hallway, creaking doors, whispers that could be the wind or could be something more. Around 3 in the morning, she heard music coming from somewhere in the house, a melancholic piano melody that seemed to carry all the sadness in the world. The next morning, she began her work. Mrs. Martha guided her through the house, explaining the tasks. The first and second floors were her responsibilities. Enormous drawing rooms filled with furniture covered in white sheets, bedrooms that looked as if they hadn't been inhabited in years, an industrial kitchen where Rose prepared meals in sepulchral silence. And that staircase. Isabel pointed to the stairs leading up to the 3rd floor. It doesn't exist for you. Mrs. Martha's reply was sharp. The 3rd floor is the master's territory. No one goes up there without his permission, and he never gives permission. Isabel spent the morning cleaning the main hall, an impressive space with a high ceiling and crystal chandeliers. As she dusted the furniture, she couldn't stop thinking about the stories those walls must hold. There was something about the house that unsettled her, a feeling of being watched, even when she was sure she was alone. It was at noon that she saw him for the first time. She was polishing an antique mirror when her reflection showed a figure standing in the doorway. Isabel turned quickly and found a man who looked as if he had stepped out of the pages of a dark romance novel. Tall, broad-shouldered, with slightly messy black hair, and eyes of such an intense green they seemed capable of seeing into her soul. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark dress trousers, a casual elegance that only money and confidence could provide. But it was the way he looked at her that made her heart race. It wasn't ordinary curiosity. It was a predatory interest, as if she were a rare piece he was deciding whether was worth possessing. "You must be the new staff." His voice was deep, velvety, with a refined Edinburgh accent that made every word sound like a caress or a threat. "Isabel, isn't it?" "Yes, sir, Isabel Thorne," she tried, to keep her voice steady, but something about him made her feel like prey before an elegant predator. "Gideon Alistair." He took a few steps closer, and she could smell his cologne, something masculine and expensive that made her head spin. "I hope you adapt well to our routine." There was something in the way he said routine that made Isabel swallow hard. "I'll do my best, sir." "I'm sure you will." Gideon smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "This house has its peculiarities, its personalities. I hope you are strong enough to handle them." Before she could ask what he meant, Gideon had already left the hall, leaving only the echo of his footsteps on the marble and the scent of his cologne in the air. Isabel stood there for a few minutes, her heart still pounding. There was something about Gideon Alistair that deeply disturbed her. It wasn't just his evident masculine beauty, nor even the obvious power that emanated from his every move. It was something darker, more dangerous. There was pain in his eyes, but also a coldness that made her question if anything human still dwelled behind that perfect facade. Over the following days, Isabel began to understand the strange dynamics of the mansion. Gideon appeared and disappeared like a shadow. Sometimes she would find him reading in the library, engrossed in old books with the concentration of a scholar. Other times she would see him walking through the garden at dusk, always alone, always with that melancholic expression that made her chest tighten in a way she couldn't explain. The other staff seemed to walk on tiptoes when he was around. Rose would lower her eyes whenever he entered the kitchen. Mr. Angus would mysteriously disappear whenever the master appeared, and Mrs. Martha would become as tense as a guitar string about to snap. But it was Julian, the mute employee, who intrigued Isabel the most. He looked to be in his 40s, tall and thin, with expressive eyes that seemed to carry secrets he could never tell. When she tried to greet him, he would just nod and leave quickly, as if he were afraid of something. "Was Julian born deaf and mute?" she asked Rose one afternoon. The cook, a plump woman of about 60, looked around nervously before answering. "No, he wasn't, but some things are best not spoken of." "What happened to him?" Rose's face hardened, and she went back to chopping vegetables with more force than necessary. "I already said, some things are best left alone." It was this atmosphere of whispered secrets and evasive glances that made the mansion so unsettling. Isabel felt as if she were living in the middle of a puzzle, with important pieces missing, and everyone around her knew something she didn't. In her first week, she discovered the mirrors. Scattered throughout the house were old ornate mirrors, all covered with white sheets or dark cloths. When she asked Mrs. Martha about them, the response was a "don't touch," so dry that Isabel didn't insist, but curiosity gnawed at her. One afternoon, when she was sure she was alone in the main hall, she couldn't resist and uncovered one of the mirrors. The surface was stained and cloudy, as if it hadn't been cleaned in years. But what shocked her was the reflected image. For a moment, she had the impression of seeing not her own face, but that of a blonde woman with sad eyes, who looked at her with an expression of desperate supplication. Isabel blinked and the image vanished, leaving only her own haunted reflection. With trembling hands, she covered the mirror again and quickly left the hall. That night, she couldn't get the image out of her head. Who was that woman? Why were all the mirrors covered? And why did she feel as if the entire house were trying to tell her a story she couldn't yet decipher? It was then that she realized she had awakened something in herself, a curiosity that had been dormant during the months of despair after the scandal. The literature professor within her was awakening, fascinated by the mystery that surrounded her, and maybe, just maybe, a little too fascinated by the dark man who inhabited the heart of that house full of secrets. Because, as much as she tried to deny it, Isabel couldn't stop thinking about Gideon Alistair, about his green eyes that seemed to see into her soul, his velvety voice that made her body react in ways she hadn't experienced in years, the deep sadness he carried like a second skin. She didn't know yet that he was also thinking of her, that he watched her from the third-floor windows, studying her every move, every expression, deciding if she would be strong enough for what was to come. The Alistair mansion had welcomed a new piece into its deadly game of seduction and secrets. And both Isabel and Gideon were about to discover that some games, once started, can no longer be abandoned. Isabel's second week at the mansion began with a storm that seemed to come out of nowhere. The heavy sky unleashed a torrential rain that turned the abandoned garden into an even more melancholic scene. Thunder echoed through the house's corridors, like screams trapped in the old walls, and the electricity flickered intermittently, creating dancing shadows. That played with perception. It was almost noon when the power finally failed completely, plunging the mansion into a dense darkness that seemed to have a life of its own. Isabel was on the second floor, tidying a room that appeared to have been a lady's study, when she heard heavy footsteps descending the stairs from the third floor. Gideon appeared at the entrance of the room, holding an old lantern, the beam of light cutting across his face in a way that made him even more disturbingly attractive. He had traded his usual formal clothes for a dark t-shirt that highlighted his athletic physique, and jeans that made him seem more approachable, though no less dangerous. "The power won't be back any time soon," his voice echoed in the heavy silence. "Mrs. Martha went into town with Mr. Angus to get parts for the generator. Rose is asleep. It's just the two of us." The way he said "just the two of us" made something clench in Isabel's lower stomach. She swallowed hard and continued folding old papers she had found in a drawer. "Don't worry about me, sir. I can keep working without light." Gideon laughed, a low, rough sound that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. "Sir, you don't need to be so formal when we're alone." He moved closer, and his masculine scent mixed with the smell of rain coming from the open windows. "You can call me Gideon." Isabel looked up to find him incredibly close, so close she could see the small scars that marked his elegant hands. "I'd prefer to keep things professional." "Why?" He tilted his head, studying her with those green eyes that seemed to see far more than she wanted to reveal. "Afraid of what?" "I'm not afraid." The lie came out too quickly, and they both knew it. Gideon smiled, a slow smile that crept up his lips to his eyes, transforming his face from a cold mask into something devastatingly human. "Liar. You're very afraid. I can see it in the way your hands tremble when I'm near, in the way you avoid looking directly at me, in the way your breathing changes." He leaned in even closer, his face inches from hers. "The question is, are you afraid of me, or afraid of yourself?" Isabel felt the world spin. It had been a long time since a man had gotten this close to her, a long time since she'd felt this kind of dangerous attraction that made her whole body vibrate with anticipation. And there was something about Gideon that was different from any man she had known. an intensity that promised both pleasure and destruction. She began, but her voice failed her. "You're much more interesting than I initially thought." Gideon brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, the touch as light as a feather, but it left her skin burning. "Most people who work here last a month at most. They feel the weight of this house and run, but you stay. Why?" "I need the money." "No, it's not just that." His fingers traced her jawline, a touch so intimate it made her legs weak. "You're curious. You want to understand the mysteries this house holds. You want to understand me." Isabel should have pulled away, should have put distance between them. But something held her paralyzed. Maybe it was the loneliness she had carried since the divorce. Maybe it was the undeniable attraction she felt for him. Or maybe it was simply the need to feel alive again. "And what if I do?" she whispered. His smile vanished, replaced by an intense expression that made her heart pound. "Then you need to know that learning the truth about me can be dangerous. This house, we're not like normal people. There are things about my past that could frighten you. Are you trying to scare me or provoke me?" Gideon laughed again, this time with genuine amusement. "Clever. Very clever." He stepped back, leaving the air between them vibrating with unresolved tension. "Come with me." "Where to?" "To a place no one else in this house can go." Against all the rules Mrs. Martha had established, Isabel found herself following Gideon up the staircase that led to the 3rd floor. The steps creaked under her feet, and she could feel the weight of her transgression like a rope around her neck. The 3rd floor was completely different from the rest of the house. While the lower floors had a melancholic grandeur, here there was a disturbing intimacy. The hallway was narrower, decorated with personal paintings and photographs that told the story of a private life. Gideon led her to a set of double doors at the end of the hall and opened them, revealing what had clearly been the master bedroom. The king-sized bed was perfectly made, as if someone were going to sleep there that night. There were women's clothes still hanging in the open wardrobe, old perfumes on the dressing table, books marked with dog-eared pages on the nightstand. "This was our room," he said, his voice heavy with a pain that made Isabel's chest ache. "Mine and Beatrice's." Beatrice. He had finally said the name of his dead wife. Isabel observed the room, trying to decipher the personality of the woman who had shared a life with the enigmatic man beside her. The books were classic literature and philosophy. There were sketches scattered on the desk, and the clothes were elegant, but with an artistic touch that spoke of someone creative and refined. "She was beautiful," Isabel said, looking at a framed photograph where a blonde woman with sad eyes smiled at the camera. "She was." Gideon's reply was curt, emotionless. "She was also complicated, very complicated." There was something in the way he said it that made Isabel look at him more closely. It wasn't the grief of a devoted widower. It was something more complex, more somber. "How did she die?" Gideon was silent for so long that Isabel thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with a bitterness that cut through the air like a blade. "Car accident. She went out driving on a stormy night after a bad argument between us. Lost control of the car on a dangerous curve in the mountains." He paused, his eyes fixed on the photograph. "At least, that's what everyone believed." "What do you mean by that?" Gideon turned to her, and for the first time since they had met, Isabel saw something close to vulnerability in his eyes. Beatrice wasn't the type of woman to run from arguments. She faced everything head-on, no matter how painful. And she knew these roads like the back of her hand. "Are you suggesting it wasn't an accident?" "I'm suggesting there are truths the police never investigated, questions that were never asked." Gideon moved to the window, looking out at the rain-ravaged garden. "Beatrice found out things about me shortly before she died, things that could have changed everything." Isabel felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of things?" But before Gideon could answer, a loud noise echoed from downstairs, the main door opening forcefully. Familiar voices reached them. Mrs. Martha was back. "You need to get out of here," Gideon said quickly, the cold mask returning to his face. "Mrs. Martha can't know I brought you up here." They descended quickly, Isabel trying to process everything she had seen and heard. When they reached the 2nd floor, Gideon stopped her with a touch on her arm. "What happened here stays between us," he said, his voice low and intense. "Do you understand?" Isabel nodded, but as he walked away, she realized she had crossed an invisible line. She was no longer just a curious employee. She had become part of something much larger and more dangerous. That night, alone in her room, Isabel couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with Gideon. There was so much he hadn't said, so many unanswered questions, and there was the way he had looked at her, touched her, spoken to her, as if she were someone special, someone he could trust, or someone he was testing. In the early hours, she was awakened by a strange noise. Footsteps in the hall, but they weren't Gideon's heavy, determined steps. They were light, almost feminine. Isabel got out of bed and walked to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. The footsteps stopped right in front of her room. With her heart pounding, she waited, holding her breath. After a few eternal minutes, she heard the sound moving away down the hall. When she finally found the courage to open the door and look, the hallway was empty. But there was something on the floor right in front of her door, an old envelope, yellowed with time. Isabel picked it up with trembling hands and went back into her room. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter in a delicate feminine script. "If you are reading this, then he has chosen you as he chose me. Beware the man who says he loves you above all else. Beware the promises whispered in the dark. Beware the secrets he keeps on the 3rd floor. And above all, beware the mirror in the library. It shows truths that can destroy your sanity. I tried to escape and look where it got me. Perhaps you are stronger than I was, or perhaps you are next. Baby Beatrice." Isabel reread the letter 3 times, her hands shaking so much she could barely hold the paper. How had a dead woman left a letter for her, and why did she feel as if every word were an urgent warning she should take very seriously? When she finally managed to sleep, it was almost dawn, and her dreams were populated by clouded mirrors, never-ending storms, and green eyes that watched her from every shadow. The next morning, Gideon appeared in the kitchen during breakfast. He seemed different, more tense, more vigilant, as if he knew something had changed during the night. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, but there was something in his voice that suggested he already knew the answer. "Like a log," Isabel lied, tucking the letter into the pocket of her uniform. Gideon studied her for a long moment, then smiled, but this time the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Excellent. Today I'd like you to clean the library. That place has needed attention for a long time." Isabel felt the blood freeze in her veins. The library, the place Beatrice had mentioned in the letter, where there was a mirror that showed dangerous truths. "Of course," she replied, forcing a smile. But as Gideon left the kitchen, Isabel noticed Rose watching her with a worried expression. "Be careful, girl," the cook whispered when they were alone. "There are things in this house that are better left alone." "What kind of things?" Rose shook her head sadly. "The kind of thing that made the last cleaner disappear in the middle of the night without a trace. The kind of thing that made the mistress end up at the bottom of a ravine. The kind of thing that can make a good girl like you get lost forever." Isabel felt a chill run down her spine, but there was something inside her. Perhaps the literature professor's curiosity, perhaps the desperate need to feel alive again, that kept her from backing down. That afternoon, she entered the library with her heart beating like a drum. The room was impressive, floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with old and valuable books, a mahogany desk that looked as if it had been carved by master craftsmen, and leather armchairs that invited long afternoons of reading. And at the back of the room, covered by a white sheet, was the mirror Beatrice had mentioned in her letter. Isabel cleaned the entire library, but her eyes kept returning to the covered mirror. With every passing minute, her curiosity grew until it was almost unbearable. Finally, when she was sure she was alone, she approached it and pulled off the sheet. The mirror was ancient and ornate, with a worked silver frame that seemed to tell stories in its intricate designs. But it was what she saw in the reflection that made her world stop. It was not her face looking back at her. It was the face of Beatrice, but not the smiling Beatrice from the photograph. This was a terrified Beatrice, with eyes wide with fear and tears streaming down her pale cheeks. Her lips were moving, forming words that Isabel couldn't hear but seemed desperately to want to communicate. Isabel staggered backward, her heart racing, but she couldn't tear her eyes from the mirror. And then, to her horror, she saw Beatrice's image raise a hand and point to something behind Isabel. She spun around quickly and found Gideon standing in the library doorway, watching her with an expression that mixed amusement with something much darker. "I see you found Beatrice's mirror," he said, his voice dangerously calm. I was just cleaning. No need to lie." Gideon entered the library and closed the door behind him, locking it. The sound of the key turning echoed like a sentence. "I knew sooner or later you wouldn't be able to resist your curiosity. It's a trait you two share." Isabel backed away until she bumped into the desk. "You two. You and Beatrice. Both intelligent, both stubborn, both unable to leave mysteries alone." Gideon approached slowly, like a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "The difference is that Beatrice discovered the truth too late to do anything about it." "What truth?" Gideon stopped inches from her, so close she could feel the heat of his body, see the small lines of tension around his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was a whisper that made her skin crawl. "The truth about who I really am, and about what I'm capable of doing for love." Before Isabel could answer or run, Gideon pressed her against the desk, his hands planting on either side of her body, trapping her between his arms. His masculine scent enveloped her like a drug, and she felt her resolve waver dangerously. "Are you afraid?" "Of me, Isabel? Should I be?" Gideon smiled, a slow, predatory smile that made something clench in her lower stomach. "That depends on how far you want to go to find out the truth. It depends on how much you're willing to risk for what we could have together." "And what could we have together?" His answer came not in words but in action. Gideon tilted his head and captured her lips in a kiss that was like a fire spreading through her entire body. It wasn't a gentle or exploratory kiss. It was possessive, hungry, charged with a passion that seemed to have been dammed up for a long time. Isabel should have resisted, should have pulled away, but her body betrayed her mind. Her arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers tangling in his black hair, and she gave herself over completely to that moment of madness. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily. Gideon rested his forehead against hers, his green eyes burning with an intensity that made her legs tremble. "This changes everything," he whispered. "I know. There's no going back now. I know." Gideon smiled, this time a genuine smile that completely transformed his face. "Then welcome to my world, Isabel Thorne. I hope you're strong enough for what comes next." When he finally pulled away and left the library, leaving her alone with her turbulent thoughts, Isabel realized she had crossed much more than a physical line. She had entered a dangerous emotional territory where normal rules didn't apply and where the price of love could be much higher than she was prepared to pay. But when she looked at the mirror again, the image of Beatrice had vanished, leaving only her own reflection, forever altered by the kiss she had just received, and the truths she had yet to discover. In the days that followed the kiss in the library, the atmosphere in the mansion changed completely. It was as if an invisible thread connected Isabel and Gideon, an electric tension that vibrated between them with every glance, every casual encounter in the hallways. He didn't try to touch her again, but his presence had become a disturbing constant that made her heart race whenever she heard him approaching. Isabel tried to focus on her work, but it was impossible to ignore the way he watched her. Sometimes she would look up and find him standing in the doorway of the room where she was cleaning, just watching her work with that intense gaze that seemed to undress not just her body, but her soul. Other times she felt his presence before she even saw him, as if her body had developed a special antenna to detect him. "You've been different," Rose commented one afternoon as she prepared lunch. Her voice was filled with maternal concern. "Are you sure everything's all right?" "Why wouldn't it be?" Isabel tried to sound casual, but she knew she wasn't convincing anyone. "Because I know that... Look, it's the same look the mistress had in her final months before she died, as if she'd seen things she shouldn't have seen, touched things she should have left alone." Isabel stopped peeling potatoes and looked at the cook. "Rose, can you tell me what Mrs. Beatrice was like? As a person, I mean." Rose looked around nervously before lowering her voice. She was a good woman, you know. Smart, polite, always treated us with respect. But, she hesitated. But she was always restless, always asking questions, always meddling where she shouldn't, just like you're doing now. Rose sighed heavily. In the end, she was paranoid, thinking she was being watched, that someone was after her. She talked about running away, about telling truths that would shake the world. A week later, she was dead. A chill ran down Isabel's spine. And Mr. Gideon? How was he with her? In love, Rose answered without hesitation. In love in a way that was frightening to see, wouldn't let her breathe without him knowing. Jealous, possessive, but also protective, you know? As if she were the most precious thing in the world. The cook shook her head sadly. Sometimes love can be so strong it suffocates a person. That night Isabel couldn't sleep. Rose's words echoed in her mind, mixing with the memory of the fiery kiss in the library and the dark warnings from Beatrice's letter. She got out of bed and walked to the window, watching the garden bathed in the light of the full moon. It was then that she saw a solitary figure walking among the trees. Gideon moved like a shadow among the wild plants, his hands in his pockets, his head bowed as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. There was something deeply melancholic in the way he walked, a loneliness that made Isabel's heart ache with compassion. Impulsively, she put on a robe and left her room. The night air was cool and filled with the scent of the jasmine that grew wild around the mansion. She found him sitting on an old stone bench, smoking a cigarette and looking up at the starry sky. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly, approaching slowly. Gideon looked up, and in the moonlight, she could see a vulnerability there that he rarely allowed others to see. "I rarely can. This house, it holds too many memories." Isabel sat beside him on the bench, keeping a respectful distance but close enough to feel the warmth of his body. "Do you want to talk about them?" He took a long drag from his cigarette before answering. Beatrice loved this garden. She spent hours here reading, writing, dreaming of the projects she wanted to accomplish. His voice was heavy with a longing that cut Isabel to the heart. She used to say the abandoned plants were more beautiful than the cultivated ones because they had to fight to survive. "She sounds like a special woman." She was. Gideon crushed the cigarette out on the stone bench. She was also stubborn, too curious for her own good, and had an incredible ability to see through the masks people wear. "Like me." Gideon turned to look at her, and the intensity in his eyes made the air between them vibrate. "Exactly like you." "Is that why you're interested in me? Because I remind you of her?" "At first, maybe." His honesty was both brutal and refreshing. "But now it's different. You're not her, Isabel. You're stronger, more determined." Beatrice was fragile underneath all that intelligence. You have fire. Fire that could burn me." Gideon smiled, a sad smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Or fire that could save us." They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the clouds drift past the moon. Isabel could feel the tension building between them, an almost physical need to touch him, to comfort him, to discover what kind of pain he carried so carefully. "Gideon," she said softly, "what really happened to Beatrice?" He stiffened beside her, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was laden with a guilt that made her stomach clench. "She found out something about me, something that changed everything between us." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration she was beginning to recognize. "I should have told her the truth from the beginning, but I was afraid of losing her. And when she found out, it was worse than if I had just been honest." "What kind of secret?" Gideon looked directly at her, and there was something in his eyes that made Isabel's blood run cold. "The kind of secret that can destroy lives, the kind of secret that made my wife look at me with fear instead of love." Before Isabel could press for more details, he stood up from the bench. "You should go back inside. It's getting cold." "Don't treat me like I'm made of glass." Gideon froze, his back rigid. "It's not that." "Then what is it? You kiss me like the world is about to end, you show me your dead wife's room, you tell me about dark secrets, and now you want to send me to my room like a child." He turned slowly, and the expression on his face made her heart skip a beat. There was desire there, but also something more dangerous, a hunger that seemed capable of consuming them both. "You don't understand." His voice was strained, controlled with effort. "I'm not a good man, Isabel. I'm not the kind of man women like you should get involved with. Why don't you let me decide that?" Gideon closed his eyes, taking a deep breath as if fighting an internal battle. When he opened them again, he had made a decision she could see in every line of his face. "Because when I lose control, bad things happen, and I can't lose you too." The raw vulnerability in his voice broke down any resistance Isabel still had. She rose from the bench and moved toward him, stopping only when she could see her own reflection in his green eyes. "Maybe I don't want you to stay in control," she whispered. His breathing became ragged, and she could see the battle he was waging with himself. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, as if he were forcing himself not to touch her. "You don't know what you're asking for. Then show me." For a moment Isabel thought he would retreat again. But then something broke in his controlled expression, and he pulled her against his body with a force that took her breath away. This time, the kiss was not gentle or exploratory. It was devastating, hungry, charged with weeks of repressed tension and a passion that seemed to have a life of its own. His hands tangled in her hair, tilting her head back to deepen the kiss, and she felt her legs grow weak with the intensity of the sensation. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily. Gideon rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, as if memorizing the moment. "You're going to be my ruin," he murmured against her lips, "or you'll be my salvation." He opened his eyes and looked at her with an intensity that made her entire body vibrate with anticipation. "Come with me." This time, when he led her inside the mansion, they didn't go up to the third floor. Instead, he took her to a room she had never seen before, an intimate space with a lit fireplace, shelves filled with books, and a soft leather sofa that seemed made for long nights of intimate conversation. "This was my refuge when Beatrice and I fought," he explained, closing the door behind them. "The only place in the house where I could think clearly." Isabel observed the room, noticing the personal details that spoke of the man behind the cold mask. Old photographs, sports trophies from his youth, books with notes in the margins that revealed a restless and intellectual mind. "Why did you bring me here?" Gideon moved to the fireplace, gazing at the flames that danced in the dim light. "Because I want you to know the real me, not the version I show the world, not the version the staff sees, the real version." "And what is the real version?" He turned to look at her, and there was a brutal honesty in his eyes. "A man who loved a woman to the point of madness and lost everything because of it. A man who made terrible mistakes trying to protect what he loved. A man who swears he won't repeat the same mistakes with you." Isabel approached him slowly, seeing the pain he carried like a second skin. "What mistakes, Gideon?" "Control, possessiveness, jealousy." Each word came out like a confession torn from him. When you love someone more than your own life, the line between protection and prison becomes dangerously thin. Did you imprison her? Not physically, but emotionally. Yes. I wouldn't let her have friends I didn't approve of, wouldn't let her travel alone, questioned every conversation she had with other men. Gideon ran his hands over his face, as if trying to erase the memories. In the end, she told me she felt more like a trophy than a wife. Isabel felt her heart ache with compassion, but also with apprehension. There was a pattern there that frightened her, but also intrigued. Her? Because as wrong as it was, there was something about the intensity of Gideon's love that drew her in like a moth to a flame. And what changed? Why did she want to run away? Gideon was silent for so long that Isabel thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was laden with a guilt that made her stomach churn. "She found out I wasn't who I said I was." "What do you mean by that?" But before Gideon could answer, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, followed by urgent knocking on the door. "Mr. Gideon." Mr. Angus's voice was filled with panic. "There's a young lady here asking for Mrs. Thorne, says she's her daughter, and that it's urgent." Isabel's blood ran cold. Olivia. Her daughter was here, in the middle of the night, in a mansion full of dangerous secrets. Gideon opened the door quickly, revealing Mr. Angus with a worried expression. "Where is she?" "In the main hall, sir. She's very agitated, crying a lot." Isabel ran through the mansion's corridors, her heart pounding with fear and anxiety. When she reached the main hall, she found Olivia sitting on the sofa, her clothes soaked with rain and her face streaked with tears. "Olivia, my God, what happened? How did you get here?" Her daughter threw herself into her arms, sobbing in a way she hadn't since she was a child. "Mum, I couldn't stand being alone in that flat anymore. I've been having terrible nightmares, strange dreams about you being in danger. I took 2 buses and hitched a ride to get here." Isabel hugged her daughter tightly, feeling a mix of relief and terror. Olivia being here meant her 2 worlds were colliding in a way she didn't know how to control. "Honey, you can't be here. This place, it's not safe." "Why isn't it safe, Mum?" Olivia pulled back to look her in the eyes, and Isabel saw the same fierce curiosity she had inherited. "What's going on? You're different. You seem haunted." It was then that Isabel realized Gideon had entered the room, standing in the doorway like a silent shadow. Olivia followed her gaze and saw the tall, elegant man watching her with an unreadable expression. "You must be Olivia," Gideon said, his voice gentle but laced with a tension only Isabel could detect. "Your mother speaks of you often." Olivia studied Gideon with the natural suspicion of a teenager, but Isabel could see the exact moment his charm began to work. He had a special way with people, an ability to make them feel important and protected. "And you're my mom's boss?" "Gideon Alistair." He approached and extended his hand, which Olivia shook hesitantly. "And you're soaked to the bone. Mrs. Martha can prepare a room for you for the night." "No," Isabel interrupted quickly. "She's going home first thing in the morning." Gideon looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, but it made her feel as if she had made some kind of mistake. "Of course, as you wish." But that night, after Olivia was asleep in one of the guest rooms and the house had returned to silence, Isabel couldn't rest. There was something about the way Gideon had looked at her daughter that unsettled her. It wasn't anything obviously predatory or dangerous, but there was an intensity there that reminded her of Rose's words about Gideon's possessive love. And there was something else that disturbed her even more, the way Olivia had reacted to him. Her daughter, normally wary of strangers, had been clearly impressed by Gideon's charm and presence. This meant he was even more dangerous than she thought, capable of seducing not just adult women, but anyone he wanted to influence. The next morning, as she prepared Olivia to go home, Isabel realized her daughter was reluctant to leave. "Why can't I stay a little longer, Mom? This place is amazing, and Mr. Gideon said he has an incredible library I'd love to see." "Olivia, you have school, and this place isn't suitable for you." "Why not? What are you hiding from me?" Isabel looked at her daughter and saw her own reflection. The same fierce determination, the same need to uncover the truth. It was a family trait that was proving to be both a blessing and a curse. "Nothing, honey. It's just that this job is temporary. I don't want you to get used to a place we'll be leaving soon." But when Olivia finally left with Mr. Angus, who would drive her back to the city, Isabel realized she had lied to herself. Because the truth was, she didn't want to leave this place anymore. Despite all the dangers, all the secrets, all the red flags her rational mind was raising, she was falling in love with the Alistair mansion. And more dangerously still, she was falling in love with the dark man who inhabited it. That night, Gideon found her in the garden again, as if it had become a ritual between them. This time he seemed different, more tense, more vigilant. "Your daughter is a lot like you," he commented, sitting beside her on the stone bench. "In what way?" "Smart, curious, determined." He paused. "Dangerously brave." There was something in his tone that made Isabel turn to look at him more closely. "Why? Do you say that like it's a bad thing?" "Because courage can be a fatal quality in the women of your family." The comment hit her like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean, women of my family?" Gideon was silent for a long moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. When he finally spoke, his words changed everything. Beatrice told me about you years before she died, Isabel. You met at a literary retreat in the Lake District, remember? You exchanged letters about literature, about life, about the limits of love and obsession. Isabel felt the world spin around her. Memories she had buried deep began to surface. The retreat, the intense conversations with a blonde, melancholic woman, the letters they had exchanged about profound questions of human existence. Beatrice Alistair, she whispered, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. She signed the letters only as B. She spoke of you constantly, about the brave professor who asked difficult questions, who wasn't afraid to explore the darker aspects of human nature. Gideon turned to look at her directly. When you showed up here looking for work, I knew immediately who you were. It wasn't a coincidence, Isabel, it was fate. Isabel's heart was beating so hard she could barely think straight. You hired me because of the letters I wrote to your wife? I hired you because Beatrice said that if anything ever happened to her, I should look for you. She said you would be the only person in the world capable of understanding the truth about me and still accept me. Isabel stood up from the bench, needing space to process the magnitude of what she had just discovered. It all made sense now, the ease with which she got the job, the way Gideon had watched her from the very first day, the sense of familiarity she couldn't explain. So this was all a charade? An elaborate game? In the beginning, yes, Gideon admitted with brutal honesty. But then you became more real to me than anything I've ever experienced. Beatrice prepared me to find you, but she didn't prepare me to fall in love with you. His words echoed in the night air like a declaration and a condemnation. Isabel felt tears burn her eyes, a mixture of anger, sadness, and a passion she could no longer deny. And what if I don't want to be just a replacement for your dead wife? Gideon stood up and walked to her, stopping so close she could see her own reflection in his green eyes. Then help me discover who I can be with you. Because the truth is, you've already changed everything for me, Isabel. You've already shown me that there is life after death, love after loss. When he kissed her again, it was with a desperation that made her heart break and mend itself at the same time. It was the kiss of a man who had lost everything once and was terrified of losing it again. And for the first time since she had arrived at the Alistair mansion, Isabel knew with absolute certainty that she was lost, not just in the mystery surrounding the house and the man who inhabited it, but lost in him, in the impossible and dangerous love that was growing between them, like a wild plant that refused to be tamed. The weight of the revelation about her connection to Beatrice kept Isabel from sleeping for the next few nights. Every shadow in the mansion seemed to hold a new question. Every corridor whispered secrets she couldn't yet fully decipher. The feeling of being a pawn in a game much larger than herself had become inescapable, yet at the same time, her attraction to Gideon grew in a way that defied all logic. It was on a rainy morning, while organizing old documents in the second-floor office, that Isabel found the first real clue about the true identity of the man she was falling in love with. Hidden among business papers and pharmaceutical contracts was a folder with personal documents dating back more than a decade. Birth certificates, university diplomas, medical records, but it was a death certificate that made her blood run cold. Gideon Henry Alistair, deceased on March 15, 2013, at the age of 35. Cause of death, severe burns resulting from a fire in a pharmaceutical laboratory. Isabel reread the document 3 times, her hands shaking so much she could barely hold the paper. If Gideon Alistair had died in 2013, who was the man who kissed her, who seduced her, who carried that name as if it were his by right? Continuing to sift through the documents, she found more pieces of the puzzle. A birth certificate for Gabriel Henry. Alistair, Gideon's younger brother, born 2 years later. Old photographs showed 2 incredibly similar men, almost twins, but Gabriel was slightly taller, with a small scar on his jaw that the Gideon she knew also had. The truth hit her like a lightning bolt. The man she was falling in love with was not Gideon Alistair. It was Gabriel, the younger brother, who had assumed the identity of his dead sibling. Looking for something specific? Isabel turned quickly to find Gideon, Gabriel, standing in the office doorway. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in every line of his body. "I found something specific," she replied, holding up the death certificate with hands that still trembled. Gabriel closed his eyes for a long moment, as if preparing for a conversation he knew would eventually come. When he opened them again, there was a vulnerability in them she had never seen before. "How long have you known?" he asked, entering the office and closing the door behind him. "I just found out." Isabel stood up from the chair, needing some physical distance to process the magnitude of the discovery. "You're Gabriel, aren't you, Gabriel Alistair?" "Yes." The answer came, simply with no attempt at denial or explanation. "Gideon died in the lab fire in 2013. I took his identity because it was the only way to keep everything he had built alive." "And Beatrice? Did she know?" Gabriel ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration she was beginning to recognize. "She found out 6 months before she died. That's when everything started to fall apart between us." Isabel felt dizzy, needing to lean on the desk to keep her balance. "So when you told me that Beatrice discovered something about you that changed everything, that, was it? That I wasn't the man she had married? That I had built our entire life on a lie? Why?" The question came out like a cry of pain. "Why would you do that?" Gabriel approached slowly, as if she were a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden move. "Because Gideon was my older brother, my hero, my only family. When he died, he left behind not just a billion-dollar company, but also a devastated fiancée and employees who depended on their jobs." Beatrice was engaged to the original Gideon? Yes, they had been together for 3 years when he died. She was destroyed to the point of considering joining him. Gabriel stopped a few feet from her, respecting the space she needed. "I had loved her since the first time I saw her, but she was always Gideon's. When he died, I saw an opportunity to have the life I always wanted, and at the same time, protect the people he loved." Isabel felt nausea rise in her throat. "You deceived a grieving woman, made her believe the man she loved had come back from the dead." "It wasn't like that." Gabriel's voice was heavy with pain. "At first, yes, it was a desperate charade, but she knew. On some deep level, she always knew I wasn't exactly the same man, and over time, she learned to love me for who I was, not for who I was pretending to be. Until she found out the truth." "Until she found out the truth," he confirmed, his voice breaking slightly. "After that, she couldn't look at me without seeing the lie. She said she didn't know if she had ever truly loved me, or if she just loved the memory of the brother I was imitating." Isabel looked at the man she thought she knew and wondered how many other lies existed between them. "And me? Am I just another way for you to keep the fantasy alive? A replacement for the replacement?" Gabriel took 2 steps forward, and this time his expression was charged with an intensity that made her heart race despite all the confusion and anger. "No, you are the first real thing that has happened in my life since my brother died." His voice was so low, she had to strain to hear it. "With Beatrice, I was trying to be Gideon. With you, for the first time in years, I'm trying to be Gabriel. And who is Gabriel?" He smiled, a sad smile that completely transformed his face. "A man who lost his identity trying to save the people he loved. A man who made terrible mistakes, but is trying to find his way back to the light. A man who has fallen hopelessly in love with a woman who is too brave for her own good." Isabel felt tears burn her eyes. There were so many emotions clashing inside her that she could barely think straight. Anger at the lie, compassion for his pain, fear of what else she might discover, and a passion that refused to die despite all the confusion. "How can I trust you after this?" Gabriel moved closer still, stopping only when he could touch her if he reached out his hand. "By not asking you to trust in words, by asking you to trust in actions, by asking for a chance to show you who I really am when I'm not hiding behind another man's identity. And if I can't? What if it's too late? Then I will accept it and let you go." The pain in his voice was palpable. "But before you decide, let me tell you the whole truth. About the fire, about how I took Gideon's identity, about what really happened to Beatrice." Isabel looked at the man who had become the center of her emotional universe and realized she had a choice to make. She could run, go back to her safe but empty life, protect herself from the pain and danger that Gabriel represented. Or she could stay and try to build something real with a man who had made terrible mistakes, but was genuinely trying to find his way back to the light. "Tell me," she whispered. Gabriel led her out of the office, taking her up to the 3rd floor again, but this time to a room she had never seen. It was clearly his personal study, filled with family photographs, documents, and personal objects that told the story of 2 brothers who had grown up together. "Gideon was 7 years older than me," he began, showing a photograph where 2 boys smiled at the camera. "Our parents died when I was 15, and he became not just my brother, but my father, my mother, my best friend. He built our family's pharmaceutical empire from scratch, put me through university, taught me everything about business and life." Gabriel moved to another photograph, this one showing 2 adult men at a graduation. "When I graduated with a degree in chemistry, he brought me to work at the company. We were partners and best friends. But Gideon was always obsessive, a perfectionist to the extreme. He worked 16 hours a day, lived in the lab." "And the fire?" "Gideon was developing a new line of drugs that could revolutionize the treatment of neurological diseases. He was working, alone in the lab late one night when something went wrong." Gabriel closed his eyes as if he could still see the flames. "When I got to the lab, everything was on fire. I tried to save him, but the burns were too severe. He died in the hospital 3 days later." Isabel saw tears in his eyes and felt her heart ache with compassion. Beatrice was devastated. The company was in crisis because the investors were afraid of the future without Gideon. Hundreds of jobs were at risk. Gabriel looked directly at her. "And I couldn't accept that. I had lost my brother, so I made a desperate decision. You decided to become him. We were very similar physically. The only people who knew about Gideon's death were the hospital doctors and a few people on the company's board, who agreed to keep it a secret to protect the business. To the rest of the world, Gabriel had died in the fire trying to save his brother." Isabel felt a chill run down her spine. And it worked. For a while. Beatrice was so lost in her grief that she didn't question the small differences in my behavior. The company stabilized. The employees kept their jobs, and he paused. "I got to have the life I always wanted. But things changed." "Over time, yes." Beatrice started noticing inconsistencies. Little things, a different way of holding a fork, a song I didn't remember hearing before, scars she couldn't explain. Gabriel sat in an armchair, looking suddenly very tired. In the end, she hired a private investigator. And she found out the truth. She found out the truth, and more than that, she found out that I had always been in love with her, even when she was engaged to my brother. His voice was heavy with shame. She felt betrayed not just by the lie about my identity, but by the discovery that I had taken advantage of her grief to get what I wanted. Isabel sat in the armchair opposite him, processing the moral complexity of the situation. And her? How did she react? At first, anger, then confusion. She said she didn't know if the feelings she had for me were real or just an extension of the love she felt for Gideon. Gabriel looked at his hands. In the end, she said she needed time to think, to decide if she could or wanted to continue our life together. But she didn't get that time. The night she died, we had our worst argument. She said she had decided to expose me, to tell the world the truth. She said she couldn't live a lie anymore. Gabriel looked up to meet Isabel's eyes. I begged her not to do it, told her it would destroy everything, the company, the jobs, our life. She told me she would rather see it all destroyed than continue living a sham. And then she went out driving in the storm. She went out driving in the storm, he confirmed, his voice breaking. I never saw her alive again. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of the story hanging between them like a living presence. Isabel tried to process it all, the tragedy of the loss, the moral complexity of Gabriel's choices, the genuine pain she could see in every line of his face. "Do you believe it was suicide?" she finally asked. Gabriel looked up, and there was a guilt so profound in his eyes that it broke her heart. "I believe it was my fault. If I had been honest from the beginning, If I hadn't used her grief for my own purposes, she would still be alive. Is that why you live alone in this mansion? Penance. Penance and protection. If no one gets close to me, no one else can get hurt because of my mistakes. Isabel rose from the armchair and moved toward him, seeing no longer the mysterious and dangerous man she had met, but a broken man trying to carry the weight of his choices alone. And me? Where do I fit into this story? Gabriel looked up at her, and there was a vulnerability there that momentarily made her forget all her anger and confusion. You are my chance at redemption, or my final damnation. Why? Because with you, for the first time since I took my brother's identity, I want to be honest. I want to be Gabriel, not Gideon. I want to build something real instead of living a fantasy. He stood and moved closer to her. But I also know I've already made mistakes with you. I brought you here under false pretenses. I used the connection you had with Beatrice. I lied about who I was. Isabel looked at the man before her and realized she had a choice to make. She could run, go back to her safe but empty life, protect herself from the pain and danger Gabriel represented. Or she could stay and try to build something real with a man who had made terrible mistakes but was genuinely trying to find his way back to the light. Show me, she said softly. Show you what? Show me who Gabriel is. Not Gideon, not the mask you wear for the world. Gabriel, the real man. Gabriel looked at her for a long moment, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then, slowly, he began to unbutton the dress shirt he always wore, revealing a chest marked with old scars, some from the fire, others that told different stories of pain and survival. Gabriel is afraid of fire, he said softly, his voice more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. Gabriel has nightmares about not being able to save his brother. Gabriel sometimes wakes up screaming in the middle of the night. Isabel reached out and gently touched one of the scars, feeling him flinch under her touch. Gabriel is also brave, enough to carry someone else's pain. Gabriel built an empire and saved hundreds of jobs even when he was broken inside. Gabriel fell in love with the wrong woman at the wrong time in his life, he continued, his hands finding her face. And now he's fallen in love again, this time with the right woman, but he's afraid it's too late to deserve a second chance. Gabriel, she whispered, and it was the first time she had said his real name. Sometimes second chances are the only ones that matter. When he kissed her this time, it was not as Gideon had kissed. It was as Gabriel, sweeter, more vulnerable, filled with a desperate hope and a passion that had been purified by truth. And as their clothes began to fall to the floor of the study, as their hands explored the uncharted territories of their bodies, as she guided him to the leather sofa and positioned herself over him with a determination that made him groan her real name against her lips, Isabel knew she had made her choice. She was choosing the real man, with all his scars and secrets. She was choosing the truth, even if that truth was dangerous and complicated. She was choosing Gabriel, and she hoped he would choose her in return, not as a replacement for Beatrice, not as part of a fantasy, but as Isabel, the woman who had learned to love the man behind all the masks. When they finally lay tangled on the sofa, their bodies slick with sweat and their hearts still racing, Gabriel traced invisible patterns on her skin with his fingers. No more lies between us, he whispered against her hair. No more secrets. But even as Isabel allowed herself to believe that promise, a part of her knew that in a mansion like this, with a history like theirs, there would always be one more truth waiting to be discovered. And she was right, because downstairs, Julian, the mute employee, was holding a secret that would change everything all over again. A secret about the night Beatrice died. A secret that would prove that not everything about that tragedy had been told. The days following the revelation of Gabriel's true identity were like living in a parallel reality. Isabel felt torn between two versions of herself, the rational woman who knew she should run from all this madness, and the woman in love who had found in the Alistair mansion not just a job, but a complete transformation of her existence. Gabriel had changed too. Freed from the burden of pretending to be someone else, he became more present, more genuine. Their conversations were deeper, his caresses more tender, and there was a lightness in his eyes that hadn't existed when he was still hiding behind his dead brother's identity. They spent their nights talking about literature, philosophy, about the dreams they had abandoned and those they still wanted to pursue. But the peace Isabel had begun to find was shattered one rainy afternoon when Julian sought her out in the garden with a desperate look on his face. The mute employee, who for weeks had avoided any close contact with her, approached with trembling hands and pulled a small flash drive from his pocket. He pointed to the device, then to her, and his expressive eyes communicated an urgency that made Isabel's heart pound. "What is this, Julian?" she asked softly, taking the flash drive. Julian looked around nervously, as if afraid of being seen, then pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. In a shaky hand he had written, "The truth about that night. She didn't drive away alone." Isabel's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? Was someone else in the car with Beatrice?" Julian shook his head vigorously, then pointed to the flash drive again. On the paper he quickly wrote, "Recordings hidden in the garden sculpture. Master can't know I gave you this. Julian, can you speak? Why do you pretend to be mute?" The man looked at her with eyes full of tears, and with great effort whispered in a hoarse, unused voice, Because what I saw that night, if I told I would be the next to die." The whispered confession made Isabel take a step back. Julian could speak, but he had spent years pretending to be mute to protect a secret about the night Beatrice died. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice trembling. Julian looked around again with paranoia, then leaned in to whisper in her ear, "I saw him follow her car. I saw him come back alone hours later, clothes torn and blood on his hands, and I saw him burn the clothes in the study fireplace." Isabel's world stopped spinning. "Gabriel?" "It wasn't Gabriel that night," Julian whispered, his eyes filled with a terror he had carried alone for years. It was different. Like he was someone else entirely." Before Isabel could ask more questions, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the garden. Julian immediately returned to his mute persona, quickly pocketing the paper and moving away as if he were just tending to the plants. Gabriel appeared between the trees, but there was something different about him, a tension Isabel couldn't identify, a sharper gaze than usual. "Is Julian bothering you?" he asked, watching the employee who quickly moved away. "No, just tending to the garden." Isabel closed her hand around the flash drive, hiding it in her uniform pocket. Gabriel studied her for a long moment, and she had the terrible feeling that he knew something had changed. But all he said was, "Julian acts strangely sometimes. Years of working in this house. I think the loneliness affects some people more than others." That night, when she was sure Gabriel was asleep, Isabel took her laptop to one of the second-floor bathrooms and inserted the flash drive. What she found there made her stomach churn with horror. They were recordings from a security camera hidden in the garden, dated the night Beatrice died. The images were grainy and in black and white, but it was possible to clearly see a female figure running desperately through the gardens, constantly looking over her shoulder as if being pursued. And then the figure of a man appeared, running after her. Isabel paused the video and zoomed in. It was Gabriel, undoubtedly, but there was something about his posture, about the way he moved that was different from the man she knew. There was an aggression there, a predatory determination that made her skin crawl. The video continued, showing Gabriel catching up to Beatrice near the mansion gate. They seemed to argue violently, and then he forced her into a car. Isabel had to pause the video to control her nausea. Beatrice hadn't gone out driving alone in a storm. She had been forced into the car by her own husband. But there were more files on the flash drive, audio recordings that Julian had secretly made over the years, suspicious phone calls and a text file where he had documented everything he had observed. August 15th, 2018. Master argues with mistress about exposing the truth, says she doesn't understand what's at stake. She screams she'd rather die than keep living a lie. August 22nd, 2018. Mistress hides documents in the study, seems to be gathering evidence. Master doesn't know. August 30th, 2018. Overheard mistress on the phone with someone. Said she'd discovered more about the fire. that maybe it wasn't an accident. September 2nd, 2018, night of death. Mistress tries to escape through the bedroom window. Master follows her. I hear screams in the garden. Then silence. Master returns alone, clothes torn, blood on his hands, burns everything in the fireplace. September 3rd, 2018. Master finds me hiding in the garden where I saw everything. Says if I tell anyone, my family is next. Have pretended to be mute ever since. Isabel finished reading with tears in her eyes and her hands trembling uncontrollably. Gabriel wasn't just a man who had lied about his identity. He was a murderer. He had killed his own wife to stop her from exposing his secrets, and she had fallen in love with him. She had given herself completely to a man who was capable of killing for love. Worst of all, underneath the horror and fear, a part of her still loved him, still missed his arms, his caresses, his voice whispering her name in the dark. Isabel spent the rest of the night awake, trying to decide what to do. Should she flee immediately, confront him, call the police? Every option seemed to carry tremendous risks, especially now that she knew what Gabriel was capable of when he felt threatened. The next morning, she tried to act normal, but Gabriel immediately noticed something had changed. During breakfast, he watched her with those piercing green eyes that now seemed more dangerous than seductive. "Sleep poorly?" he asked, but there was something in his voice that suggested he already knew the answer. "Just a bit of insomnia." Isabel forced a smile, but she felt as if she were acting for her life. "I see." Gabriel took a sip of his coffee, never taking his eyes off her. "Sometimes, when we discover unsettling truths, they haunt our minds and keep us from resting." The sentence was delivered casually, but Isabel felt it was a veiled threat. He knew. Somehow Gabriel knew she had discovered something. The day passed. In almost unbearable tension, Isabel performed her tasks mechanically while trying to plan her escape, but Gabriel always seemed to be nearby, watching, waiting. Mrs. Martha was also strange, casting worried glances at Isabel as if she knew something was about to happen. It was late in the afternoon when the situation exploded. Isabel was in the study, pretending to organize documents while actually searching for additional evidence when Gabriel entered and locked the door behind him. The sound of the key turning in the lock echoed like a death sentence. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Isabel turned slowly, trying to maintain her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." Gabriel smiled, but there was no warmth in his expression. "Julian is an interesting man. He's worked in this house for over a decade, always been extremely loyal. But last night I found him rummaging through my personal study. When pressed, he temporarily regained the ability to speak." Isabel's heart stopped. "Where is Julian?" "Safe. For now." Gabriel approached slowly, like a predator cornering its prey. "The question is, where do you fit into this story, Isabel? Are you an innocent victim who got caught up in something bigger than herself? Or are you a threat that needs to be neutralized?" "Gabriel, if you hurt Julian..." "You'll do what?" He laughed, a cold sound that had nothing to do with the tender man she had known. "Call the police? Tell them about the recordings you watched, about the evidence you've gathered against me?" Isabel backed away until she hit the desk, realizing she was trapped. "It doesn't have to be this way. We can what, Isabel? Pretend you don't know I killed my wife? Pretend you're not afraid." "Of me?" Gabriel stopped right in front of her, so close she could smell his familiar cologne that now made her feel nauseous. "Or maybe you think you can save me? That your love can turn a murderer into a good man?" "I know there's good in you," she whispered, even knowing it was a desperate attempt. "I've seen it when you talk about your brother, when you touch me. That can't all be a lie." For a moment, Gabriel's cold mask faltered, and she saw genuine pain in his eyes. "You don't understand. I didn't want to. I hurt Beatrice. I loved her more than my own life. But she was going to destroy everything, the company, our life, my brother's memory. She left me no choice. There's always a choice. Not when you love someone enough to kill for them," Gabriel whispered, his hands planting on either side of her on the desk, trapping her. "And I love you like that, Isabel. I love you with the same desperate intensity I loved Beatrice. What scares me is, what will I do if you try to leave me?" The threat was clear, and Isabel felt pure terror coursing through her veins. But there was also something else, a strange compassion for the broken man before her, who confused love with obsession, protection with control. "Gabriel," she said softly, trying a different approach, "if you really love me, you won't hurt me. And you won't hurt Julian. We can find a way to resolve this without more violence." "How?" "Let me help you find peace. For real. Not through lies or violence, but through acceptance. Through forgiveness." Gabriel looked at her for a long moment, and Isabel saw the battle he was waging with himself. There was genuine love there, but also a darkness that seemed to consume everything around it. It was then that the sound of sirens echoed from outside the mansion. Gabriel moved away from her quickly, running to the window. Police cars were driving up the winding road, their headlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. "Son of a bitch," he muttered, turning to her with an expression that mixed anger and betrayal. "You called the police." "No, I didn't." But then Isabel realized the truth. Olivia. Her daughter had promised to go home, but knowing her fierce determination, it was possible she had gotten worried and decided to investigate on her own. And if she had found the recordings— "It was Olivia," she whispered, her stomach churning with fear. "My daughter must have found evidence and—" Gabriel closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, there was a resignation there that was almost more terrifying than the anger. "So it's over," he said simply. "Gabriel, you can turn yourself in. You can confess and—" "No." His voice was strangely calm. "I'm not going to spend the rest of my life in a prison, away from you. And I'm not going to let them separate me from you now that I've finally found something real." The sound of the sirens was getting closer, and Isabel realized with growing horror that Gabriel was making a final decision. "What are you doing?" she asked when she saw him take a special key from the desk drawer. "I'm going to show them that some loves are too big to be contained by human laws." Gabriel unlocked a drawer she had never seen opened before, revealing an old but well-maintained gun. "And I'm going to show you how far I'm willing to go to not lose you." "Gabriel, no, please." But he had already left the study, leaving Isabel alone with the growing sound of sirens and the terrible certainty that the Alistair story was about to have an even more tragic ending than she had imagined. And as she ran through the mansion's corridors, trying to find a way to prevent the approaching catastrophe, Isabel wondered if the love she felt for Gabriel was real enough to save him from the darkness that had consumed his soul, or if she too would be consumed in the process. The chaos that followed seemed suspended in time. Isabel ran through the mansion's corridors, screaming Gabriel's name, while the sound of the sirens became deafening. When she reached the main hall, she found the front door wide open and police officers entering with guns drawn, led by a young female detective she recognized immediately. "Olivia!" Isabel shouted upon seeing her daughter enter behind the officers, wearing a bulletproof vest that looked enormous on her teenage frame. "Mom!" Olivia ran towards her, intercepted by an officer. "Are you okay? He didn't hurt you." Where did you get—" "Hacked the mansion's security system," Olivia answered quickly, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and determination. "After I left here, I couldn't stop thinking something was wrong. I came back secretly twice, installed surveillance equipment, got access to the old recordings. Mom, I found everything about Beatrice's death." Before Isabel could fully process her daughter's words, screams echoed from the second floor. The officers ran upstairs, and she followed them, her heart pounding with terror and anticipation. They found Gabriel in the room that had been his and Beatrice's, standing before the window with the gun in his hands, but not pointed at anyone, pointed at himself. "Mr. Alistair," the lead detective said in a firm but careful voice, "put down the weapon. We can resolve this without any more violence." Gabriel turned slowly, and Isabel's heart broke at the expression on his face. There was no more anger there, no murderous determination. There was only a deep pain and an exhaustion that seemed to have consumed all his life force. "There's no resolution for what I've done," he said, his voice strangely calm. "I killed the woman I loved because I couldn't accept that she didn't love me the way I loved her." "Gabriel, no." Isabel tried to approach but was held back by the officers. "Stay away, Isabel." His green eyes met hers across the room, and there was so much love and remorse in them that she felt tears burn her own eyes. "You deserve a life free from all this darkness. Don't let it end like this," she screamed, struggling against the hands holding her. "You said you loved me. If you truly love me, don't make me carry the guilt of your death for the rest of my life." For a moment, Gabriel hesitated, the gun trembling in his hands. It was then that a hoarse, unused voice echoed, from the bedroom doorway. "Master, it wasn't like that." Everyone turned to see Julian in the doorway, his clothes torn and a wound on his forehead, but alive and standing. In his hands, he carried an old wooden box. "Julian!" Isabel felt relief flood her chest. "You're okay." "I am, Mrs. Thorne." Julian looked directly at Gabriel, his words coming with difficulty after years of silence. "But I need to tell the whole truth, not just what I saw, but what I heard." Gabriel lowered the gun slightly, confusion replacing the despair in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Julian opened the box, revealing an old tape recorder and several cassette tapes. "The mistress. She recorded everything, every conversation, every discovery. And on the last night—" His voice failed, but he forced himself to continue. "On the last night, she found out something about the fire that killed Master Gideon." "That doesn't matter now, Julian," Gabriel said, but there was a desperate plea in his voice. "I still killed her." "You didn't, Master." Julian placed one of the tapes in the recorder with trembling hands. "The mistress, she ran from you that night because she found out you didn't cause the fire. She found out someone sabotaged your brother's lab." The silence that followed was absolute. Gabriel let the gun drop to the floor with a dull thud that echoed through the room. "That's impossible." "Listen," Julian said simply and pressed play. Beatrice's voice filled the room, clear and determined, even through the poor quality of the old recording. "September 15th, 2018. I finally got access to the lab's security logs. Gabriel, if you are ever listening to this, you need to know the truth about your brother's death. The fire was not an accident, and you were not responsible for it, even indirectly. I managed to trace the financial transactions that led to the lab's sabotage. Someone from within the company, someone who benefited enormously from Gideon's death and your rise to power, orchestrated everything." Gabriel staggered as if he had been physically struck. "No, it's not possible." The recording continued. "I also found out why you feel so guilty about the night of Gideon's death. You argued with him a few hours before the accident, said things you didn't mean, and then blamed yourself for not going to the lab that night. But, Gabriel, you need to understand, even if you had gone, you probably would have died with him. The fire was planned to leave no survivors." Isabel saw tears streaming down Gabriel's face as he processed his dead wife's words. "Why did she never tell me this?" he whispered. Julian switched the tapes. Because she wanted to be sure before she accused him. Listen to the rest." The second recording was from the night of Beatrice's death, and her voice was filled with fear and urgency. "Gabriel is home. He's furious because he found out I've been investigating the past. I tried to explain about the discoveries, about the sabotage, but he won't listen. He thinks I'm trying to make up excuses to justify marrying him, even though I knew he wasn't Gideon. God, how did this all become such a mess? I love him. I love Gabriel, not Gideon, but he's so lost in his guilt he can't believe it." Gabriel sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. Beatrice's voice continued. "He said if I exposed him, I would destroy everything Gideon built. He doesn't understand that exposing the truth about his identity isn't the same as exposing who really caused Gideon's death. I need to get out of here. I need to think. I'm going to drive to my sister's house, stay there a few days until I can find a way to make Gabriel understand that—" The sound of a violent argument interrupted the recording, followed by screams and the sound of something breaking. Then Beatrice's terrified voice, "Gabriel, stop! You don't understand. I have proof of who really killed your brother. It wasn't you. It was never you." And then the sound of a car crash echoed through the recording before everything went silent. Julian turned off the recorder, his own tears falling freely. He didn't kill her. She crashed the car because she was fleeing in the rain, trying to get to her sister to explain everything. The master got to the crash site and found her dying. She used her last moments to make him promise he would investigate who really caused his brother's death. Gabriel looked up, and Isabel saw a completely broken man being slowly pieced back together by the truth. "Why did you never tell me this?" he asked Julian. "Because you went mad with grief after she died. You burned every recording you found, said you didn't want to hear her voice anymore, and I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you would fall even more in love with her memory and never be able to move on." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with years of unnecessary guilt and self-inflicted pain. Finally, the lead detective spoke. "Mr. Alistair, based on what we've just heard and the evidence Ms. Thorne has provided, it seems you did not commit homicide. Assuming a false identity is a crime, but considering the circumstances, she..." looked at the other officers. "We will need a full investigation, but it doesn't appear that you pose a threat to society." Gabriel looked at Isabel across the room, and there was a desperate question in his eyes. After everything he had discovered, after all the mistakes and all the lies, was there still a place for them? Isabel didn't hesitate. She broke free from the officers holding her and ran to him, throwing herself into his arms with a force that nearly knocked them both over. "It's okay," she whispered against his neck. "You're okay, we're okay." Gabriel held her as if she were the only real thing in a world of ghosts and distorted memories. "Isabel, I don't know how to start over. I don't know how to live with everything I've done, all the lies I've told." "We'll learn together," she said, looking directly into his eyes. "Gabriel, not Gideon. You exactly as you are, with all your scars and all your pain. We'll build something new, something true." 6 months later, the Alistair mansion had undergone a complete transformation. The windows that had remained shut for years were open, letting sunlight flood the corridors that had been dark for so long. The garden had been restored, blooming again under the care of Julian, who now spoke freely and had become not just an employee, but a dear family friend. Gabriel, who now legally used his own name, had undergone months of investigation and therapy. The truth about the sabotage that caused Gideon's death had been uncovered, leading to the arrest of the company's financial director, who had orchestrated everything to take control of the business. Gabriel had completely reorganized the company's structure, establishing charitable foundations in his brother's name and creating a more humane and transparent work environment. Isabel had returned to teaching, but now at a private university, where she could teach literature without the weight of her past scandal. Gabriel had used his connections and resources to completely clear her reputation, exposing her ex-husband's corruption and restoring her academic credibility. Olivia, who had revealed herself to be a talented hacker and a natural investigator, had won a full scholarship to one of the country's top universities, specializing in digital security and criminal investigation. On a golden autumn afternoon, Isabel and Gabriel walked through the renewed garden, hand in hand, watching Olivia teach Julian how to use a computer under the shade of a century-old apple tree. "Sometimes I still can't believe we're here," Gabriel said, stopping to look at the house that had been his emotional prison and was now his true home. "After everything that happened, after all the lies and all the pain, maybe it's precisely because of all that we're here," Isabel answered, lacing her fingers with his, "because we walked through the fire and came out stronger on the other side." Gabriel turned to look at her, and his green eyes shone with a peace she had never seen before. "I love you, Isabel Thorne. Not like I loved Beatrice, not as an extension of some fantasy or need for redemption. I love you as Gabriel loves Isabel. Simply, completely, honestly. And I love you too, Gabriel Alistair. All your scars, all your flaws, all your imperfect and beautiful humanity. When he kissed her under the golden late afternoon light, it was a kiss that sealed not just their love, but their choice to build a life based on truth instead of lies, on healing instead of guilt, on hope instead of despair. That night, after Olivia had returned to the city, and Julian had retired to his quarters, Isabel and Gabriel sat before the fireplace in the study that had witnessed so many painful revelations. Now, it was just a cozy place where they could talk about the future instead of hiding from the past. "Rose wants to know when we're getting officially married," Isabel commented, snuggling on the sofa beside him. "Mrs. Martha is already planning the party, even without our permission." Gabriel laughed, a genuine, carefree sound she loved to hear. "And what did you tell them? That when you're ready to ask me, I'll be ready to answer?" Gabriel stood up from the sofa, and for a moment Isabel thought he was going to get more wine. Instead, he knelt before her, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "Isabel," he said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion, "you saved me from a darkness I thought was permanent. You taught me that it's possible to love without possessing, to trust without controlling, to live without lying. I can't promise it will always be easy, but I can promise it will always be real." Isabel felt tears of happiness burn her eyes as he opened the box, revealing a simple but stunning ring. "Will you marry me? Not Gideon Alistair, not the fantasy of who I thought I should be, but me, Gabriel, the imperfect man you helped rebuild." "Yes," she whispered, holding out her hand for him to place the ring on it. 1,000 times yes. As he slid the ring onto her finger, Isabel knew she had found not just a love, but a true partnership. Someone who had seen his own demons reflected in hers and chosen to fight alongside her instead of running away. Outside, the Alistair mansion stood majestic against the starry sky, but it was no longer a prison of secrets and pain. It was a home where love had triumphed over darkness, where truth had prevailed over lies, where two broken people had found a way to become whole again. And on the 3rd floor, in a frame above the fireplace, the photograph of Beatrice smiled serenely, as if she were finally at peace, knowing that the man she had loved, the real Gabriel, had finally found his own happiness. Love can heal even the deepest wounds, can transform even the most lost souls, can build bridges over the darkest chasms. And at the Alistair mansion, it had done exactly that, creating a story that began with secrets and ended with the purest and most honest of truths. That true love knows no boundaries, fears no imperfections, and always, always finds a way home.